Hello and welcome to Composer's Journey from Inspiration to Creation. This is episode 3 of our series on Flight of the Seeds by Aaron Buckley-Mantell. Welcome, Aaron.
Hi, Dylan.
This is a very exciting episode for me because we get to go into those nuts and bolts, the real details of melody and construction of the piece. We've talked in episode 1 about the genesis and the inception of the piece, the inspiration behind it. In episode 2, we were talking about the very first notes, putting that proverbial pen to paper and creating textures, and the way that ideas that feel really important at first can be thrown out, cut for a bit, but then might also come back in unexpected ways and kind of be recycled. And we talked about finding this first kind of image and texture of the wind, and the way that the wind is kind of whipping up. You're whipping up this strong wind, maybe even a bit of a stormy wind, and it is causing this flight of the seeds, and starting to see the seeds flurry and gather and fly through the air. So we've got that palette, and we were talking about some of the construction of texture, moving from that really warm string figure with these big warm chords into something a bit more playful, syncopated in the woodwinds. And we're kind of on the move now, and melodies, they start coming pretty thick and fast, and that feels like a really strong and rich, a very painterly world of the flight of the seeds. Like, it's almost like I can hear these, the brush strokes of these different seeds, and even different kinds of seeds flying through the air, because you were talking about these kind of feathery seeds that flutter like a piece of paper, but then it's also the sycamores that are kind of helicoptering. What was your approach to constructing melody and approaching the kind of the counterpoint and the polyphony that builds through the middle section of the piece?
I think that, any piece of music for me has to have a great melody. So, it's the thing that you are listening to, isn't it, really? As you're listening to the piece of music, it's the thing that you can sing back. And I think, the melodies for me in this piece are the representations of the seeds as they're floating, flying, falling, whatever it is that they're doing. And the beginning very much is, as we said, sort of floating like a piece of paper, as it's just sort of flipping through the air. And then we're off on this journey, because when the sort of feather-shaped seed, as it falls down, it's not in its optimal flying position. It's just been dropped, and then it sort of takes a moment to find its position where it wants to then fly off and get as far away from the actual tree as it can. And when it's off on this journey, it just sort of flies like an aeroplane. It's so amazing, just watching this. I'd never even seen this seed before. I don't think we have it in England, but it was quite magnificent to watch. And as it comes down to the actual ground, it sort of has a bit more of an ebb and a flow to it. So when it's sort of higher up, it can have a bit more of a hover, and then as it comes further down, it kind of goes up and down a little bit, like it's riding this invisible wave, I suppose. And the melodies are trying to describe the movement that's taking. So whether it is that first cascading falling effect, and then when it's soaring, hopefully the melodies are soaring as well. And then later on in the piece of music, where the sycamore seeds are starting to twirl, then they don't just come as one individual seed. There's often way more than one of those around, and so they come in quite a thick texture. And for me, in a strange way, the melodies that sort of start off are kind of in the woodwind, and they sort of represent the seed. And then when it goes off on this soaring adventure, the melodies aren't actually in the woodwind, they're in the brass and the cello section. And then we move then into sort of the trumpet section. But in all those instances, that's very much is representing that flying, soaring feeling. But then when I come back later on to the next section, where you've got these really fast woodwind runs, scale runs, then those are the things that are representing the seed again, but at the same time you also have these melodies that are going on within the trumpet and the violin lines. And I think it was important to me to move the melodies around the orchestra, so you have different people playing it at different times, and it creates obviously not just movement within the melody, but movement within the textures of the melody. So you not only have movement within the textures underneath of, that forms the foundation of the music and sort of the harmonic structure and the rhythmic structure, but you also have movement within the textures of the melodies as well.
Yes, there's spatial movement there as well, which of course reflects the flight of these seeds through the air and into new ground, I suppose, and cascading that around the orchestra. I know cascading was a key word for you from the very start, talking about the melodic approach. And the movement does, as you say, it becomes thick, but it also has a great clarity to it, and that's quite a delicate balance. And I know you have this great body of work as an arranger as well as a composer. When you have your kind of arranging hat on, what are the techniques or the principles that you bring to keeping that clarity even when the texture is becoming so kind of thick and the air is full of seeds? Because you have so many lines running through woodwind and strings, and of course with these big kind of horn lines and trumpet lines. What should we bear in mind to make sure that all of that remains kind of clear and structured to the ear?
I think one of the things I had in my mind was, I remember listening to an interview with a film composer, and he was talking about how, I think he was like, you shouldn't really have more than 3 things at once going on in the orchestra. And there's probably a simplification of it, because his music's really cool and really complex. But like, if every single player is playing something different, it's really easy to do that. But at the same time, it all sounds quite muddy and quite messy. And so it's kind of trying to create clarity within that, and having, like, for instance, the middle string players will play, they're playing the same rhythm. They're playing different notes because they're playing a harmony. They're harmonizing with each other, but they're playing the same rhythm. And then, so you think, right, okay, this is the rhythm of this section. And then, you might then have like a long, gentle melody that kind of moves over the top of it. And that means, that's probably the thing that you're listening to, but it's a bit slow. It's not too fascinating by itself, which is where you have these sort of, and I'm thinking about a particular piece in the music, actually, I'll play in a sec. And then you have these sort of decorative things that are going on all around that, but at the same time shouldn't necessarily overpower everything else that's going on. So you need to try and sort of balance these different things which are happening. So if I play this little section here where we've got the sort of flute and woodwind runs, this is an early version, so it's not fully fleshed out, but you'll see what I mean. So the thing I hear when I listen to that is the thing that's obvious to me is, all the quick woodwind stuff that's going on. So just a quick clip is this. So that's the thing that my ear is drawn to, I suppose. But also you have this melody which is played by the sort of upper string first violins and the trumpet, which is going on as well. And that melody is actually, if you remember me talking about in another episode about me being bored by a particular bit, this is that bit which I was bored by, because it's like, oh, lovely melody that is, but when I was playing that on the originally, I think the strings underneath had this sort of stormy rhythm going on, where the strings are going like like that, and because it's quite each note is quite long, so it takes a long time for the melody to travel anywhere really. But at the same time, I really liked it, and so then underneath that, you also have this rhythmic stuff that's going on. So yeah, you've got that, string rhythm stuff that's going on, and that's kind of how we talked about in the last episode, the driving force of, keeping the momentum going. So you've got that momentum moving rhythm, and then you've got this long melody over the top, which just those two elements by themselves, I found didn't complete the package, which is why then, why I also wanted to put in these quick flurries. And I think for me, the woodwind stuff represents, the journey that this seed is going on. And at this point, I don't actually know whether it's the feather seed or the sycamore seed. It's just some seeds are on some journeys and they're doing whatever they want. And this is the point, where we were talking about using inspiration with the video that I was looking at. This is the point where it was sort of transitioning between the floating feather and the sycamore trees. And for me, like, the latter part of this phrase represents some more of the sycamore stuff. But actually, here I was able to just take it musically, like where I wanted to, and I just sort of thought, okay, just pop the video to side, ignore that, turn that off for a bit, and let's just follow this thread within the music which is going. And I still think, that thread is still telling the journey of the seed, which I want to tell. And so that's why, why I really like that.
It's really interesting to hear in cinematic terms. Just at the point that you're kind of putting the video away and taking the piece on its own journey and going where the piece is suggesting to you, this kind of polyphonic section with the trumpet and violins on this long legato melody, and then this flowing flurry of seeds up in the flute and the piccolo. It feels like a pan out, like a zoom out and a panning across, like this flurry of seeds. I can see perhaps we've started at the very start of the piece with those very delicate harmonics and the flute melody. We're maybe just looking at one seed. That's maybe in the kind of Attenborough like language of this scene. We have our one kind of protagonist seed, but by this point it's this whole chorus of seeds just kind of flowing. I think that's an effect created by the polyphony and by these long, fast scale runs in flute and piccolo, and they're coming down from higher and higher, like almost like maybe we've seen kind of seeds on like middle branches kind of falling down, but now they're kind of coming over the top of that image. Because when we first meet, when we meet this melody in the flutes, right at the start, and I want to talk a bit about melodic construction. It's quite low in the register of the flute. That's kind of one observation, and the other is that related to the melody that in the section you've just played is in the trumpet and the first violins. It's doing a similar thing in that low flute melody right near the start, which is reaching up to notes that are either suspensions or dissonances, particularly. I'm thinking when the harmony moves to this minor chord, to B flat minor, the melody sits on a C for a while, creating this kind of, in like jazz terms, you say it's like a B minor 2, or even it's like a ninth. And so there's something there in the melodic construction where you're sometimes jumping up or sometimes moving down to these unresolved notes. I'm getting a sense of that push and pull, the tension of the way that the wind carries and drops and then picks up again, these flurries of seeds. I'm really hearing the flight side of the piece, because we've definitely met seeds, but now how to convey that sense of flight. And it is something that's almost always unresolved. It hasn't landed. We're not hitting the ground yet. But when you're constructing this melody, as you say, with this principle that every piece needs a great melody, How did you find your way towards that? And were you thinking in those terms of kind of tension and dissonance, or is it something a bit more intuitive or kind of emotional?
Probably a bit more intuitive and emotional, I think. Naturally, there are logical ways which you have kind of constantly thinking about. So, if you know what chords, I always, whenever I'm doing my writing, write down every bar, I write down what chord is happening, so that I can then easily write melodic material around those chords. But at the same time, I quite like when you have notes that resolve into the next chord, for instance, or resolve out of you might have a note that's within the chord and then it doesn't resolve onto the next chord, it stays on that note, but everyone else moves. So I quite like those two types of movements, because I think it does create this sort of tension, I suppose. But it's not necessarily something that I'm actively thinking about. It's more like, here's the movements of melodic stuff I have in terms of, these are the notes of the chord, and then how do I move around those notes and get from here to there? Can I go via a different route, for instance? That kind of tends to be, instead of being dun dun dun, you might go dun 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 dun, that kind of thing. And you might, that note beforehand, maybe it doesn't go dun dun, maybe it goes dun dun. Maybe it goes up, maybe it goes down beforehand. And I think the one that resonates best with you personally is, that's, where it becomes more intuitive into the sound that you're trying to create.
Yeah, I really feel that from composing, and that feeling of almost a melody kind of clicking. And sometimes that's a matter of decorating it and just pushing it that bit further, not getting to where it's going straight away, but adding those tensions and suspensions. Sometimes it's the opposite. It's kind of simplifying it and being a bit more direct. And so it's often about the interplay, because I suppose you've got these very busy flute and piccolo lines that stay in the world of the scale and the key that we're in. So they're rhythmically and as you say, kind of dynamically very prominent. That they fit so logically with the harmony that's going on. So, but then perhaps your longer textures in trumpet and violin are that they have that permission to be long and kind of and a bit more a bit more suspended, and the interplay of those two, it gives you pointers for both melodies. And I like what you were saying earlier. It feels kind of related to think of this piece as almost a duet between wind and seeds. We start with wind, but then once seeds are in, they keep on kind of speaking to each other, bouncing off each other, and whatever kind of musical jobs one set of melodies is doing, the other can kind of fulfill the complementary jobs, be that of kind of high and low range, consonance and dissonance, fast and slow, all of those things. And they're in that dance together, while at the same time, all of those melodies are being passed around the different sections of the orchestra. So it's kind of constant rolling variation that gives the piece so much kind of momentum, especially in that middle section where we're really taking flight. We were talking in the last episode about the partner force of the boredom test. There is the goosebump test. I mean, certainly for me, listening to this, like those moments where the flute and the piccolo fly over this long, strong wind melody of trumpet and violin one, like that's definitely a goosebump moment. Like to continue using like cinema Hollywood terms, it's like a money shot of the piece. Where were you at in your creative process when this came around, and how did it feel when you made it?
I can't fully remember where I was in the creative process, but I think like the next thing that came along this point was just working through it chronologically. And I think for me it was having that trumpet and violin melody which I liked but wasn't finished yet, which I then sort of put aside so I could bring it back later. Bringing it back there was the right moment to do so, after I think exploring the bit beforehand, which for me was the goosebump moment, which was this melody that's played sort of within the brass section and the cellos. Let me play that section a minute. So that for me was where, the soaring first happened. And then after that point, it kind of carries on, but the soaring is no longer necessarily the seed that's soaring. Perhaps it's like you said, it's that wind kind of takes on the transformation then of the trumpet and the violin. And I think, for me, it was that lovely brass melody that's going on, is that sort of goosebump moment for me. And I think in some ways, one of the contributing factors to that is not just the melody and the stuff that's going on, perhaps rhythmically and harmonically. It's the kind of the percussion stuff that's going on. Like the percussion isn't particularly, it's quite sparsely used, I suppose, in this piece, I think, but it's always used as an impactful way to emphasize something. And it's those transition moments. I think that's what I'm trying to say. Like the transition moments from one section into the next section of the piece of music as we move from, seeds falling to seeds soaring and all that kind of stuff. It's how you transition between those moments, whether it's this, huge timpani roll that's going on, or this cymbal roll that's going on, or some other dramatic half a bar rise type thing that's going on in the orchestra. Those are the things which turn things up on the goosebump test meter, as you're thinking that, oh yeah, I got it, when there was that transitioning into that next bit, and then you're just sort of riding the high basically throughout that passage.
And it is such a high.
Open the next version actually.
While this different version, this newer version of the piece is opening, I had a question for the probably the fans of digital audio workstations, which is when do you decide to start a new version? Again, is that a kind of an intuitive thing, or do you have a particular sense of kind of a goal to reach in a version before you move on to the next? What's your process there?
With this project, I wanted to preserve sort of early draft versions. And I think also when I'm working in, as you heard in earlier episodes, where there's, me playing the first idea I came up with, then a slightly different variation, the starting point of what I ultimately ended up with, there's even more stuff in between all that. There's more experiments going on in between those different things. And my Logic session must just run for ages. And, even after the point where I've discovered, scrap all that stuff I came up with earlier, this is the bit where I'm going to carry on with. I keep all the stuff earlier, and it's quite a messy session, really. And then afterwards, once I've done that bit, but again, I'm not sure where the piece is going after this point. So then I'll sit down at the piano and do some improvising and try and find perhaps where it's going next. And that might just be, like 2 or 3 minutes of me just playing the piano and just not very well. You have to sort of think, what am I doing with this type of idea? And again, sometimes they don't necessarily go anywhere, but it's thinking time. You're thinking whilst you're playing. You're thinking, is this going here? Is it going here? You're sort of putting your feelers out, I suppose. And I think, when it came to, this next version, which I've just opened, this is the version where I'm like, I'm 100% committed to this idea now, because I've deleted all of the other scrap ideas which I haven't used. So I've removed all of the earlier stuff where I had those nice melodies, which I, up till this point, was still sort of exploring a little bit in certain areas. And so I've gone, right, no, we're getting rid of all of those. And now I've neatened everything up. I've got rid of all the ideas that happen later on. And I've laid it out into different sections as well. So I'm thinking about, okay, what's the ultimate structure of the piece of music? Like, what is for me, the visual cue for this section? So the opening is section A, a gentle breeze. Then we move on to section A, alternate version of a gentle breeze. Then it's section B, the seeds falling free from the tree. And then you've got, there's a gust of wind, which lasts for 2 bars. And then there's the seeds take flight. There's all these different sections, which I've actually come up with little descriptive names for them. And they really helped me in terms of, like, what was my idea for that section of the music. And having those early versions is still useful because you can sort of go back and listen to them if you really wanted to. But I think it's not wanting to throw away all your ideas, but at the same time, you've got to move on from some of them. Like this version that I've got open now, for instance, is very close to the end result. But again, I just wanted to preserve, actually, just so I could show you really that, these are the slight different versions, slight different variations, which you'll see in this version to the finished piece, where for instance, maybe there's this section here which I can play, where in the final piece the flute plays the melody and the harp sort of does this dancing motif stuff that's going on around it. Whereas here, the first draft I did, the violin was playing that melody. So here it is with the violin playing that melody. So in the end, I ended up didn't get the goosebump vibe from that one, and I was like, got to move that violin melody line. Everything else that's going on sounds really nice, but I'm not 100% sold on that. So I moved it onto the flute, and then that also freed me up. It meant that I could still put a solo violin line in there, but it meant that it could be more of a supportive role. And I also ended up layering in these sort of a little bit of horn would come in here, and they would just come in sort of one by one, just a little emphasis in different areas, and just sort of adding a little bit of lift to what's going on.
After our big flight and this kind of epic pan across the flurry of seeds, as I imagine it, we enter a slightly calmer space, a space of maybe the seeds beginning to settle, and the harp triplets there, and the way that eventually the flute, or in what we've just heard, the violin, is duetting with this flowing triplet melody. I love the sense of kind of coming into land that we have there. I feel like maybe the harp picks up the seeds, but the way that the arpeggios kind of jump down and descend, it's almost like bringing them into a very soft landing. Like when they're flying, there's that kind of brighter texture of flute and piccolo, but then the harp has something a little bit mellower. I mean, it's still got the attack, so I can still hear that it's individual seeds, but they're the descending arpeggios that have maybe been hinted at earlier, but not in triplets in kind of straight time. There was that kind of semi-quaver figure earlier that's like da da dun da da dun da da dun, and now that's become da 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 da, and it's just flowing, and we get into this kind of final section of the piece where things are starting to settle again. So, and melodically, we're bringing back melodies that we've had before, but with a very different dynamic and a different arrangement. I'm interested in the boredom test and the goosebump test, and it's probably important to say that that doesn't mean always trying to kind of ramp it up. It probably means more like find a change or find a variation. And what's actually happening here is we're taking things away, and the piece kind of very beautifully and quite serenely starts to kind of flutter down to earth. What are the intuitions that you have, like making that? Because I think so that's one of the things. Yeah, the triplets are right there in the first voice note. That's something I wanted to know. Yeah, you're humming triplet. I think that you're humming the triplets in like 3 time, and here they're in 4. But it's that same sense of kind of rhythmic flow. When you start to lay the idea down and lay the piece to rest, kind of what's your approach to pulling back, and what did this used to be like? Kind of what process did it go through?
I thought of this section as sort of slow motion. So up until now, like everything's been happening in real time, and when helicopter seeds are going and you see more than one, it's quite a spectacle, and it's like, it's very chaotic. Whereas in this section, in the sort of video inspiration I was using, there's these amazing slow motion, like really super slowed down shots of these seeds just rotating. And it sort of just felt like dancing to me. And I think I wanted to create this delicate dance-like feel. And so that's kind of how the triplets in the harp part came to be, because the harp is it's a lovely instrument. And I think it's nice, I find, when it's more exposed. It really shines through when perhaps the rest of the orchestra is quieter or drops out for a little bit, and the harp can kind of come through. And here the actual harp is, the patterns are descending because the seeds are falling, but the actual starting note of each falling pattern, the harp is playing exactly the same melody that the violin is playing. But where the violin holds its note, the harp starts to descend. So it's like the violin's playing dun 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 dun, whereas the harp is going dun 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 dun, and each of those dun 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 is a falling pattern. So it has this, it's tracing the same movement whilst maintaining this falling pattern, and this having this triplet pattern also gives it, for me, this sort of dance-like feeling. And I wanted to have, like I've referred to being bored earlier on by another piece where it was just, you know, slow trumpet melody and slow string melody, and it sounded nice, but it was a bit dull and boring. Whereas actually, that doesn't mean that, you know, like it has to be faster and more exciting. You know, it just has to be more interesting. That's the end thing. And here, stripping it back and having this breathing, subtle, delicate moment is still super interesting. It might not be filled with as much excitement, perhaps, and as much energy, but it's definitely filled with as much beauty.
I love this. What becomes sound? I mean, in terms of the prominent instruments, it feels like a flute and harp duet, as you say, with that kind of emphasis and warmth coming in on the horns. And the very first melody that we've heard has kind of come back in this section, and that relates for me to a question about form. And it feels like one of the reasons, or one of the ways that these melodies can be passed around the orchestra and can be developed and extended by different sections of the orchestra is that you've kind of constructed the piece in a variation form. It's not strict variation because the harmonic cycle doesn't repeat exactly, and it does shift, but it feels like there are enough similarities in the harmonic rhythm and enough certain familiar chords that we hear, like the lovely like F major chord. They come back as these points of contact where we can feel, oh, we've hit this chord, so we're about to hit another section. So yeah, kind of zooming outside to the question of form, which is so linked to the details of melody and what melody you're able to use and how you develop melody at different moments. Did you sort of discover this form of? I mean, I would call it a kind of altered variation form. So I suppose two questions: Would you agree that with that assessment of the form, and also how did you arrive at the larger form? I know we've been talking about the way that you used the video of Seeds from the Attenborough documentary. What happened to the form once you'd let go of the video and were putting your own sections in place?
I think to begin with, I definitely was not really thinking about form, apart from in the opening. Like the opening has the gentle breeze sound, and then it repeats again in a slightly different way, where the strings are a little bit more sort of stormy feeling. And that is the sort of a conscious variation, whereas like it's the same chord sequence, but slightly different pattern. And then after that, you sort of have these, as the sort of seeds take flight and they go off on this journey, then I didn't really think about the form. I just, wanted to create something that complemented the video inspiration that I was using, and sort of told this story mode, I suppose. And I mean, personally, like when main sort of orchestral music that I tend to listen to is film music anyway, which often doesn't typically have a traditional form in the sense that an A structure where it has, or like a song has a verse and a chorus, verse, chorus, bridge. And film music sometimes can do that, but often it doesn't, because it's following the action of what's happening on screen. So it's kind of, the form is dictated by the image in some ways. So it kind of has its own fluid uniqueness. I personally find really interesting, but I was conscious, especially when I got to that sort of slow, delicate harp bit, where I was like, up till now, a lot of the melodic material has kind of been quite new, and I felt like great pieces of music, they don't have one unique melody that goes from the beginning all the way to the end of the piece of music without ever repeating itself. So I was like, something's got to come back again, you know, in order to give the audience, give them something that they've heard before, even if it's a variation, something familiar. And so that's where, at that point, the video had actually ended, and so I had no more video inspiration. So I was very much was like, okay, so here, you know, I've got to lead it in my own direction. And, you know, having the slow motion, the stuff, it was very much like, right, that's the delicate bit, and then it needs to build to this glorious climax before we then come almost full circle and we come back to the, you know, the gentle breeze. And I think, like, I always knew that I wanted to end the piece of music with this pizzicato note from the bass players at the very end, which for me was the sound of the seed just hitting the ground and just like landing. And so that's kind of where I knew it was going to end. And I think I just found that form, yeah, probably wasn't really a consideration up till about 3/4 of the way through, I would guess. That's when I was thinking about, how do I bring this back and you know, reuse some of the material which I've already created? Because yes, you can keep on creating new ideas and stuff, but it's nice to, in terms of music, to be able to return to familiar sounds, and especially when they're familiar but they're in a different form, a different version, I suppose.
Yeah, and perhaps a more appropriate label for the form, if we need one, which we probably don't, is AVA rather than theme of variation from that point of view, because we meet the seed, we go on the flight, which is our kind of transformation with all these new melodies, and then we return to the seed again. And it's been on this journey, and it is in an altered form. It was a seed on the branch, and now it's a seed on the ground, but it's still the seed. So yeah, I could see maybe the narrative structure is more of that kind of hero's journey structure. Of, you know, we meet them, they go on a journey, and then they're the same but different at the end. And of course, yeah, it's just so satisfying to kind of hear that melody come back in a different form. The pits on the bass at the very end that you said you were kind of determined to have, of the seed kind of landing in the ground. You're in very good company there, because one of my very, very favorite pieces of music is Mahler's Fifth, and the first movement ends with that same, the first theme is returned and it's passed around. I think maybe it's in the flute's last, and it kind of goes up, da 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 da, and then boom, end of first movement. Like it's really plants something in the ground, doesn't it? That kind of grows. So yeah, very good company to end your movement with a strong pits in the low strings. We've reached the end of Flight of the Seeds, the first creative pass through the journey that you took, Aaron, in your creative process, working through the piece. And we've also looked at all of the variations and developments that get us from a collection of different themes and ideas into this beautiful cohesive arc and storyline of the seeds, detaching from the branch, fluttering down to earth. Thank you so much for sharing that journey with us, Aaron. And in the next and final episode, we will look ahead to performance and making final edits and touches, and to life during and after the piece's premiere. Thank you so much, Aaron.
Thank you.